But no Walking Dead. No Umbrella Corporation. Not even a zombie unicorn apocalypse. Which is a thing, and I think that one's pretty cool. But anyway, Jesus was dead, He is alive, and He will never die again. And He's no zombie Jesus. And no apocalyptic summer blockbuster film. What is this crazy story? Myth? Metaphor? An ancient sci-fi or fantasy? Some of us are so familiar with the story that we yawn and ho-hum our way through the motions of Easter. Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. Hallelujah. Another cup of coffee, please. Some of us are here only to please a family member. And honestly, it's a good thing to make Mama happy. Because, you know, when Mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. Some of us are out-and-out skeptics, even if we show up here every week. This resurrection thing is not simply irrational, it is almost beyond imagination. And I have to admit, I do feel sorry for folks with such a stunted imagination, but I digress. In Paul's letter to the Romans, he invites powerful imagination. He tells the story of personal transformation, something that he imagines as impossible without Jesus, and he overlays this personal transformation story with images from Easter, from Exodus, and creation. First, creation. In chapter 5 of Romans, immediately preceding this scripture passage, he talks about the human story as encapsulated in Adam, the first human, the proto-human. In Adam, all our stories are found. In Adam, we all sin. In Adam, we all die. But Paul proposes there is a new Adam. A new proto-human with a new story for us. It's Jesus. In Jesus, we are righteous. In Jesus, we live. Paul uses this creation story, the images from the creation story, to talk about personal transformation. He also uses images from the Exodus story. Here in our main text, Paul uses baptism language in a way that aligns with Israel's deliverance from slavery in Egypt through the sea. It's only through water that we experience God's gift of newness of life. Paul even uses slavery language to describe the human condition apart from the grace of God. He says that we might no longer be slaves to sin. Verse 6. And in verse 8 and verse 9 he says, death is no longer master over him. So Paul talks about personal transformation in line with creation, in line with Exodus, and in line with Easter. In the sacrament of baptism, powerfully visualized the baptisms by immersion. We are buried with Christ. We die with Christ. We are crucified with Christ. And we are resurrected with Christ Jesus. And here's where we discover that the gift and the promise of Easter and the imagination required to appreciate it is so huge, so much larger than we thought. Christ is risen.
Christ is risen indeed.
Hallelujah. Okay, you'll get a few more chances to pick up the pace on your reaction time. A couple major stories have come out, been published this week on Yasiel Puig, the absurdly talented phenom of the LA Dodgers baseball team. Last year, in his first season in Major League Baseball, he hit .319, and he didn't start until June when he was called up. And he hit .333 in the playoffs. That's really, really good. And despite being in the minor leagues for the first couple months of the season, he finished in second place in Rookie of the Year ballot in the National League. But this week's stories are not about his accomplishments in the sport, but about the story of his 2012 defection from Cuba. A story that includes imprisonment, assassination, death threats, human trafficking, captivity, immigration, and drug cartels. In Cuba, Puig was paid $17 a month to play baseball. After his escape, he signed a $42 million contract with the LA Dodgers. Now, it's still planet Earth, but it might as well be a whole nother world. And to pass from one world to the other, to begin his new life, he had to go through a death, and he had to go through water. Perhaps Paul's language, and perhaps the resurrection story itself, is not such an irrational idea and an unimaginable tale as we might think. For Paul, Jesus' death and resurrection is precisely the thing that opens for us a door to a new life. Not just in the time to come, but beginning here and now. Pope John Paul II, using Paul's ideas long before he became Pope in 1966, wrote his Easter Vigil poem, and he named Jesus the man who became the body of history. His story becomes our story. The Apostle Paul uses similar language on a much more personal tone with the Galatian disciples when he writes to them in chapter 2 of Galatians, "I've been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. The life I live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me." Jesus' story, death and resurrection, becomes our story as we are baptized into Christ. Christ is risen.
Christ is risen indeed.
Hallelujah. Over 20 years ago, I was stuck. I needed to move in a new direction, but I couldn't figure out how to do it. I was stuck, after all. My father-in-law and I met for breakfast, and he said to me, "JP, don't let your past dictate your future." Well, that's great advice. No. It's a whole lot easier to say than to do, but I've learned to live by it. I've learned to die and embrace new life. I've discovered for myself that it is only possible because Jesus Christ has opened the door. Because of Easter. Maybe you were mired in a depression that you can't imagine ever putting in the past. There is newness of life. Maybe you are stuck in a relationship that is violent or abusive. There's newness of life. Maybe you find yourself in a dead-end job. There's newness of life. Maybe you're beset by self-destructive habits. There is newness of life. Jesus is the body of history. In his death, we die to our past, whatever it is. In his resurrection, the door is open for us to an Easter future. Christ is risen.
Christ is risen indeed.
Hallelujah. Now, the main difficulty of this passage from Romans 6 is the language about freedom from sin. You know, we hear that, we look at our own lives, we inspect ourselves, and we say, not yet. Maybe I don't believe hard enough, as if that were possible. Maybe I don't try hard enough. Maybe Easter just doesn't work or doesn't work for me. What we miss when we struggle with this language is that Paul is not talking about sin in terms of human behavior, but talking about sin as a power. Sin in the imagery of a violent slave master that rules and dominates our lives with destructive and sometimes lethal force. Paul's using the language of Exodus when he says we are now free from sin and death. Israel, the Exodus story, Israel had lived in slavery for over 400 years. In a cataclysm of plagues and then through the water of the sea, God delivered them. They were no longer slaves. Pharaoh no longer had dominion over them. They were no longer subject to abuse. But they had no idea how to live as free people. It took time. All the facts on the ground were new and different. The reality that defined and shaped their lives was freedom. They had to learn to live in it. Yasiel Puig has to learn to live in a new world. I had to learn to live in a new future. And often that's exactly what we need to do. When Paul describes freedom from sin in Romans 6, he's using that imagery of Easter to describe, imagery of Exodus to describe the power of Easter. He's speaking about the new reality, that we are no longer enslaved and dominated by sin and death. He's describing new facts on the ground. The freedom, the newness of life in which we are called to live and learn. We can learn it. We can live it because it is no pipe dream. no fairy tale, no sci-fi adventure. It is based on the new facts on the ground, on an event in history that changes everything. As surely as Christ is crucified, we have died to our old way of life. As surely as Jesus' tomb is empty, just like those eggs over there, so sin and death are emptied of their power. As surely as Christ is risen, so we are unstuck, free to live gloriously and victoriously. Easter. Resurrection. No Walking Dead, no Umbrella Corporation, no zombie unicorn apocalypse. But if apocalypse can mean simply the end of one world and the beginning of a new one, the end of one life and the beginning of a new life, then it just might be the perfect word for today. Christ is risen.
Christ is risen indeed. Hallelujah.
Let's stand together for our